So we are going to use the readings that you guys work through to try to understand these major concepts related to parties and their control of the government. Understand that this timeline that I gave you or that I had you create, this is simply one analysis of party eras. You might read a different professor, or you might read a different textbook that might classify this information differently. It's a historic concept. It's where we look back retrospectively and we try to classify and understand a behavior. So if you go on to study history or you go on to look at political science, different historians might choose to classify this differently, but it's always the same basic concept. And so I like this one because I just think it's a good broad way of understanding. So the readings that you summarized in the hall and that you looked over classified this into American history into 5 major party eras. And so I have them written here for you. Party eras are simply a time period where the executive and the legislature are dominated by a particular party. That does not mean that from 1800 to 1860, every president was a Republican or, a Democrat. It doesn't mean that every legislature had a Democrat majority for that whole time period. But it means that when we look back, we notice that, wow, for that 60 years, the Democrats really controlled the federal government and potentially even state governments. When we look here, we notice that there sure were a lot of Republicans. And then in terms of public policy, if you think about that, if we had a 72-year period where the Republicans dominated federal policy making, that's probably going to translate into a lot of policies that the Republican Party was hoping to see adopted, particularly because while we still have a system of checks and balances, when the executive and the legislature are the same party, that does make that process a little smoother. All right, so a critical election. Critical election and party realignment goes together. Okay? Critical election is kind of a misnomer because it doesn't have to be a singular election. And again, it's not like a current events thing. You're not going to flip on the news and hear a reporter talking about a critical election happening. It's retrospective. We look back and we see that it happened. This one is a little different, so we'll talk about that one in a second. But here, and here, we most certainly experienced a critical election. So we have to think about historically what happened in 1860, Civil War, 1932, Great Depression, and then 1968. I'm going to kind of lump it together. I'm going to say several things were happening. We had the Civil Rights Movement. We also experienced the death of a president. We very soon after that, we had Watergate. So we had just a lot of shifts. Oh, and Vietnam, obviously. So let's put these in particular. So if I tell you that these are examples of these time periods of critical elections happening, what then would be a critical election? A critical election is a time period where we have some serious domestic crisis that alters the political agenda, and we have people shift their allegiances. And so what we experience is a party realignment. Okay? So let's do this for example. So in 1860, we see the rise of the Republican Party, right? Post-Civil War, Republican Party goes from being a third party to being now one of our dominant parties. And for decades, we see the Republican Party dominate. So think what we learned about demographics. Who would support the Republican Party in 1860? Well, it would have been people that were happy or people that supported the North primarily during the Civil War. So we would have people that live in cities. We would have people that live up north. Generally speaking, we'd have people who are more progressive, right? Because we also had like the women's movement in conjunction with the anti-slavery movement. We would most certainly have had former slaves. And really anybody who had been, positively affected by the end result of the Civil War. So if you look at that, would that describe a Republican today? No, definitely not. So the party realignment is where we have some kind of critical election, and as a result of that, we have groups of people that realign their party preferences. So 1932, we experienced a Great Depression, crisis unlike one our country has ever seen. Government responds, and these people become happy with this particular response. And so allegiances begin to shift. Again, it's not an overnight thing. It's not a suddenly progressives were Republican and now they become Democrat. It's that it just changed over time. And we look back retrospectively and we see that that happens. Okay? Okay, party de-alignment. This is a really interesting time period here. So, 1968, if you look up on the wall and you look at the face of all of those presidents and you go through and you think about what their parties were post 1968, okay? So we have, so that was after LBJ. So we have Nixon was a Republican, Ford was a Republican, Carter was a Democrat, Reagan was a Republican, Herbert Walker Bush Republican, Clinton Democrat, W Republican, Obama Democrat. And if I were to give you a chart where I would show you the majority of the legislature, like what party dominated the House and what party dominated the Senate, the only one of these presidents that for more than 2 years had their party control the legislature was W. So in other words, we get Reagan elected in 1980, significant time, lots of change, capitalizing on this Reagan Revolution. 2 years after that, his party lost control of the Congress. Same thing happened to Clinton. Same thing happened to Obama. Okay? Now, W was an anomaly, but remember during his presidency we had 9/11. So we did border on this idea of a critical election, but nothing really came to fruition. We didn't ultimately have a shift of allegiances. And as a result, we went back to this back and forth. We call this where people are moving away from party loyalty, where we're moving more towards issue voting. That's party de-alignment. So party de-alignment is where we lack loyalty. So you go back here and you look at my grandparents' generation and the loyalty was intense. You go here and I think about my parents' generation and the loyalty is incredibly lacking. So what we need to think about is, well, what was the difference? What was the difference that made my grandparents say, oh, wow, government really, we need to vote for them, to now here suddenly not trusting government? How is the response of the government different here, and different here? Well, hopefully some of you right now are thinking media. Whoops. Because the reality is, if we had seen everything going on in the Civil War as we were sitting at home watching, eating our TV dinners, sitting around the table, we might very well have felt differently about how the government responded. We also had kind of a coming together as a crisis, but this was not necessarily a coming together. Aftermath, absolutely, and a positive direction, but it really caused incredible divisions and factions within our country. So when we look at this party de-alignment, we refer to this as divided government. Divided government is where you have a presidency of one party and at least part of the legislature of the other party. It might not be both parts, or it could be. It just depends. So if you think about divided government and how difficult it becomes then in an era of divided government to accomplish major policy change, you understand the impact of party then potentially on what the government is able to do.